Hello and welcome to our second video for the Holistic Leaders Yoga School. The intention with these videos, again, is every week to just capture very brief summaries of what we covered. And, of course, having the opportunity to get to be in person and together offers a whole different dynamic in the learning journey and what each student gets to bring. And certainly if you want to continue that spirit, feel free to leave comments and have active discussion, though I know commonly on YouTube it can be a good place for criticism. So hopefully, setting the intention that the dialogue and discussion and comments is intentional and mindful. So with that, this week we've been working on intentions. And what's interesting right now is we're this stage of the program where we have the intention to focus really on Jnana Yoga, the yogic path of right knowledge. So really learning a lot about yoga, humanities, the philosophy, the lifestyle. And intention setting is a very common thing that in most yoga classes you encounter. So in our class and in our discussion, I kind of opened just the discussion up by asking everyone, what does intention mean? What does setting an intention mean? And getting to discuss it was very interesting, discussion around it being, really of goal setting, of living in a way that's, mindful and purposeful. And also some of the challenges around intention setting, and that it's almost become, it seems almost phony in some ways, or at times how intention setting can seem like too much control, and maybe our yoga practice is actually a place where we want to let some of that go. So, intention setting seems to have a variety of people's individual experiences with it. So when we're talking about it here, what we're really talking about when it meets the yoga culture is this idea of sankalpa. And sankalpa, most have heard of it, and if you haven't, what it really is defined as is really looking for the deep resolve of your heart. And to find the deep resolve of your heart, it really takes, developing quite a bit of self-awareness and connection to your own heart, and being able to learn about it to then draw it out, to draw it forth. And so, the real question is what ways can we connect more deeply with our heart and its self-awareness? And I think that one of the ways that we can do that is through contemplative practices. So one major thing that we covered during this week was contemplative practices. And for those who don't know, the movement of contemplative practices is one that really is inspired by yoga, as well as a variety of mind, body, spirit traditions. And it's kind of where I see mindfulness moving into. Currently we're in a big trend in our society of the mindful movement. And I think contemplative practices is kind of the next step or the next direction we're moving in. So when we call something a contemplative practice, when something is, being contemplated, what that really means is it's not that we're thinking about it or contemplating, but we're actually looking that when I learn about something or I get some kind of exposure to something, what in me is alive from that? What in me is, speaking to me about that? Where do I, if I'm learning about a topic, where do me and that topic join? And, when this goes back to intention, this can be a great way to look for the deep resolve of our heart. What is it that is really on my heart? So, when we're looking to contemplation and contemplative practices, there's a great model, a tree of contemplative practices. And in this tree diagram, at the base of the tree, we see two foundational things that branch off into these different branches of practices, and we'll talk about those different categories of practices. But at the base and the foundation are two things, and these two things are the main goals of contemplative practices. So you want to remember this, write this down. These are the same things I believe that yoga is about. And the foundation is either self-awareness of our patterns of thoughts and feelings and behaviors, which in yoga we know as samskaras, these karmic cycles of how we choose to react and respond, and draw a certain energy to us that then causes us to continue that pattern until we're ready to let it go, as well as, and so that's the first, self-awareness, and then the second is connection and communion. And through different contemplative practices, sometimes we can not only learn about our old patterns, but sometimes when we're in meditation or in our yoga practice or doing one of our contemplative practices, we connect to something greater than ourselves. We commune with something greater, and whether that just be a simple insight, God, the universe, a new perspective, that's what we're talking about. So all the contemplative practices at their base have self-awareness or connection and communion. So now when we're talking about these things, especially self-awareness and in contemplation, really another way to articulate this way where we're finding the point where we join is with a topic or what we're learning is realizing that everything in our life is a stimulus. And based on that stimulus, there's certain mental, emotional, relational, behavioral patterns. And for holistic education, what's essential, now bringing this into the picture, in holistic education and the way that we do the program is when something's alive in you, my intention for the program is to listen to those deep resolves of your heart, to listen to those sankalpas, and to bring them out. So the deep resolve of my heart is that each student can be mindful and aware and self-aware of what each practice is arising in them, and then in our discussion and our dialogue to be able to bring it out, to share and to have some discussion, and that to be a model of learning. So with that, the different sorts of practices that the tree of contemplative practice has, there's 7 main ones. So the first, and what is often considered the most important one, is stillness. Stillness is practices like meditation, yoga nidra, sound journey, where you're actually able to just sit in the stillness, lay in the stillness, and in doing that, insights can arise. So, variety of practices under that branch of stillness. The next is generative. And generative practices are things like loving kindness practice, where we're seeking to evoke a feeling in ourselves. You know, with loving kindness, we look to generate the feeling of love within us, and then to extend it out to the people we love, even to the people that we hate or have difficulty with. But it starts by filling ourselves first and then extending it out. The third limb in this practice is the creative process. And the creative process really has to do with, creativity, not for the sake of what we're actually creating, but the process of doing it, how we can really connect with ourselves in the journey of getting to create and learn, those 2 foundational roots, of self-awareness and connection and communion. How can our creativity be a means of connecting with that? The fourth, which is similar to our stillness practice but kind of the opposite, is our movement practice. These are the things where mind, body, and breath are united. Yoga, dance, aikido, ecstatic dance, these sorts of things. The next is our relational branch. And our relational branch stands for any situations where we're coming together with people. And things like heart shares, dialogue, nonviolent communication. These are often the more contemplative relational practices. Next is our active or our activist branch. And these are things that are like being of work or service. Our karma yoga pathway towards deeper connection and self-awareness. So how through our work and actions can we connect to that? So then the very and the last branch on this contemplative tree is ritual. And rituals are the rites of passage, the annual, at different stages of our life milestones, things like turning 16 in our American culture and being able to drive, or turning 18, becoming an adult, or 21 where there's all these privileges. So these are different milestones, marriages, weddings, funerals, different rites of passage that we have. So, while there are all these different branches, when it comes back to yoga, what we really have to ask is, what is my pathway? And so, what are the practices that I do? Because if we can't relate it to our own life, it's hard to understand. So what we did was within each of these 7 branches, we wrote on a piece of paper what our practices were, and then we drew our own contemplative trees. And in drawing, we got to share, where we have a lot of practices, where we're surprised, where maybe there were practices we thought that used to be really important to us, but based on the current situation of our life, they're not so, emphasized. So drawing it out can be a very interesting activity, and one I would encourage you to do if you haven't already. And more importantly, when we start to draw it, we start to get a picture of potentially, which of the yoga paths are ours. And yoga paths are very similar to the contemplative tree. When we look at the main paths of yoga, these main paths, we have things like bhakti yoga. This is the devotional path, the path where we're often chanting mantras and working with emotions and evoking a particular feelings and transmuting them to God. And this is the original path, really. This is the path in the cave where the old, shamans and saints and swamis and mystics would sit in the caves chanting to God, to want to make their minds one with that higher energy, that higher consciousness. Now, of course, that wasn't a very practical path, so it's evolved now to modern day, like things like kirtan and mantra meditation, which sometimes mantra is considered its own path. Additionally, a path that we're including is Jnana Yoga, or the yoga of sound vibration. So that's another main path that we'll be covering in our program, Sound Journey, Sound Meditation. But really one of the more modern paths is Raja Yoga. We get Raja Yoga from, one of the main texts, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And, in this, it's the 8-limb system. The first 2 limbs are your yamas and niyamas, which are basically the yoga commandments, 10 commandments of what, you should be doing and shouldn't be doing. Next, we have our asanas. And interesting enough, in the sutras, they just, the asanas are the physical poses we want to be comfortable in. And it's funny because in the sutras, really, all they really have to say about it is to be seated comfortably. And why is that? Well, because at this point in time, it was primarily about meditation. And so the next 5 limbs are all really geared towards meditation. Pranayama, which is how do we purify the energetic body through breathing practices. And in breathing, we actually can help release some of those karmic samskaras we talked about earlier. Shedding some of those sheaths or those layers that we've held on to. Pratyahara. Pratyahara is the practice of really being able to remove yourself from the senses. Our senses are sights. There can be distracting sights that come up, sounds, things we hear that can pull our attention, tastes, smells. And to really go inward into meditation, we have to we have to gain mastery over the senses and bring it in. And as we start to bring it in, we get into dharana, which is really the limb, the step of focusing the mind. It keeps wandering. Mindfulness is at this stage. How can we bring it back in until eventually we reach dhyana, the single focused mind, the meditative state. And then through that, we then can dip into a deeper state, which is all these last limbs are hard to even explain. You have to experience them. But the last is samadhi, or kaivalya. And this stands for, enlightenment, union of the small self with the greater self. So this is the path of Raja Yoga. So we covered Bhakti, Nada, and Raja. And after Raja, we get the Hatha Yoga lineage and practice from the Hatha Yoga Prapadika. And this is the physical practice. This is where the poses really expand to be more than just sitting. And Hatha Yoga actually stands for sun and moon. So how can we find the balance of our solar active, satira structure with our tha, our lunar cooling, sukha, resting energies? And how can we find those and be comfortable in poses? So we have Bhakti, Nada, Raja, Hatha, and then we also have Karma Yoga. And Karma Yoga is the yoga of service. This is how through the work that we do can we connect with that deeper level of wisdom within us. And really the final path, and the one that we're focusing on, which I've already mentioned, is Jnana Yoga, the path of right knowledge. And really the path of right knowledge is all about recognizing that our suffering, we don't have to suffer, but we do suffer when we have a mistaken identity. And the mistaken identity is that instead of knowing ourselves as a spiritual being, having a human experience as a soul that's pure, we have identified with particular relationships, dramas that are happening, specific thoughts, difficult emotions, actions and behaviors we took. And when we learn to pull back from all these things and refocus in on the notion that we are a spiritual being, a pure soul, that frees us from the attachment to those things and can help us to reunite with a greater wisdom. And Jnana Yoga is said to be the hardest path, but also the fastest path. So this is our review this week of our week 2 in our Jnana Yoga step of the program. And I hope you enjoy.